Hey guys, so it's about a few weeks until the 2024 presidential election, and I think a lot of people in the future are going to sort of wonder what happened. First of all, a lot of people will not understand that a lot of voters are not going to participate because of voter fatigue. In my case, I'm not even in the United States. Now, I'm a lawyer, licensed in California. You would think that if anybody, would want to vote or would be inclined to vote, it would be somebody who, is familiar with the systems, who is able to analyze the policy positions and so on and so forth. But in fact, a large percentage of people have, at this point in an empire's decline, have left or have divorced themselves ideologically from that country. And so you're going to see that a lot of the best people are going to be overseas rather than in the United States. So that's one of the issues. It's simply voter fatigue and the fact that people do vote with their feet, which in some cases makes it a little bit harder to actually vote. Number two, the other issue will be, immigration. Now you think about the fact that, I'm an immigrant. I'm now essentially kind of an immigrant twice over. Now you think about the fact that, we are now looking at elections in many cases on a single issue. A lot of voters are going to vote based on a single issue, whether or not it's access to guns, personal firearms for protection, whether or not it's access to something else, healthcare, abortion, and so on and so forth. In the past, the death penalty used to be quite sort of a value signifier, and of course now we have immigration. But the problem is that a lot of the people who you would think would vote a certain way might actually vote the other way, just as a strategy. It's basically counterintuitive. But in this election, you have Michigan, which has probably a more powerful Arab American lobby. Not necessarily Muslim, but just, in general, the Democrats who are represented by Kamala Harris have had some statements that are probably a little bit more pro-Arab American than the other side, than the GOP, which is represented by Donald Trump. However, if you're somebody who actually looks beyond the surface, like myself, you'll see that Kamala and Trump's positions are almost entirely the same. It's just that, Kamala Harris is a little bit better at communicating more balance, not necessarily in any of her actions, but in her statements. And so some voters, if I were to vote, and I were in Michigan, I would vote for a third party, because there is a third party, Jill Stein's party, that has been different, that has had a policy decision that is different from the two major candidates. And so it's also the case that, people might try to vote differently, even if they would be negatively affected in the short term. So someone like me would not be voting for Kamala Harris in Michigan to send the Democratic Party a message, but that message would be short term. So the flip side of that would be, well, wait a second, I've sent the Democratic Party a message regarding Arab-American relations within the United States, but in fact, if it turns out that Kamala Harris loses Michigan, as I think she should, but if she does lose it, and therefore probably the election, what will end up happening is that, if the GOP is able to come in and cement political influence as a result of winning, change the laws, and so on and so forth, how do you count the votes, etc. It may very well be that to the extent that the Democratic Party wants to change its platform into something more substantive, it won't be able to do so. And therefore, you're sort of locked in. But in the short term, when you think about, what happened in Germany in 1933 and so on and so forth, you have to also understand that even if you're a minority, a lot of times people won't vote based on necessarily, short-term or most obvious, or just any sort of obvious objective. A lot of people will vote on a single issue. A lot of people will vote on charisma. A lot of people will vote on something else that may not be logical to you. It may be logical to me that Kamala Harris does not deserve to win Michigan, but that's my opinion, and probably not something that a lot of people might agree with. So that's the other second. So you've got voter fatigue, voters voting with their feet, You have, again, people voting in a way that is counterintuitive. And I think the third part is, again, sort of a follow-up from the second part, which is, if in fact you are a minority, and I keep talking about minorities because, I am thinking about Germany in the 1920s and 30s when it was the most powerful country in the world. It was certainly a leader in science, math, and technology, and so on and so forth. And it didn't really matter in the end because of the way that the focus shifted from, just scientific accomplishment to blaming people from within that were minorities. And I do think that's probably happening now in the United States, but that's sort of that's just a good segue into the third point, which is that a lot of times, the people that are going to have the best rhetoric, again, are not necessarily the most honest people. So if I'm a minority, so let's say I'm a minority in the United States, I may want to vote against the party that's just telling me, sweet nothings, that's just telling me whatever that I want to hear without any sort of substantive action that's backed it up. And the reason that would be logical in my case and from my thinking would be that, if you are in a position where someone wants to put you in a camp or so on, you actually want the guy who is, foaming at the mouth to be in charge, because at least you know which way the wind is blowing. Whereas if you have somebody that's whispering sweet nothings into your ear, you don't really know what's going to happen. You might get a notice to show up at a train station, and who knows where you go. But the guy who gets in, who's foaming at the mouth, I think is a better signal if you're a minority, and there's no, again, this is only true if there are no substantive differences, in the policies, especially the foreign policies of the two major candidates. So again, those are the three things. I'm now in Singapore, and I want to show you something interesting here because a situation where it's a little bit easier to be here because it's not, it's essentially a one-party state, but you can see, people here have a different mentality of Islam. So, it's not like in the United States where Islam is characterized through essentially OPEC and Middle Eastern oil money. Here it's quite different. The Sultan of Johor gave refuge to Sufis that's just a few miles away historically, and so you've got also the fact that ASEAN, or Southeast Asia, is for the most part 40% Muslim. So it's a very different mentality here. You can go out and get what would be the equivalent of, say, kosher food. So you can look around, and of course, over here the breakdown would be Chinese, Hindu, and essentially Malay, which oftentimes almost always overlaps with Islam. So you've got, unfortunately, in this complex, you don't have a lot of Sikhs. For some reason, you don't have as many Hindus. So I don't know whether or not the quota system is working as well as it used to, which again might be something that this looks like. This is a Hindu place. You can see the flip. It's really interesting because I was mentioning the Germans, and the first house is actually a flip. Look at this. So a lot of people will look at that. I don't know if you can see it, but it is what appears to the West to be a symbol of the National Socialists, but it's actually flipped. It's actually a Hindu symbol. So you've got something where, again, there's a little bit more, there are broader categories here in Southeast Asia, in part because people here cannot afford to take a simplistic version of religion. It is so diverse that that's not really possible, even with quota systems. So that's basically it. I think that, ultimately, this election is Chinese. This election is going to be interesting, but I think that, overall, it is something where if you want to study American history and German history, one thing you realize is that when we're studying as Americans and looking down on the Germans in the 1920s and 30s and so on, you never hear about the other side. Who was opposing the National Socialists? Were they competent? Were they, were they different substantively? what was going on. And at this point, nobody really cares because you're dealing with a failed political system. So nobody's really going to take the time, when time is limited, go down and study failure that happened a long time ago. So over here, you have a lot of construction, things are building. It's different. And so it's something you want to think about when you look at countries that not necessarily fail, but who have political turmoil. You want to look at the fact that, number one, who was really in the opposition? And number two, what was the economy like? What was happening 10 years before the rise of extremism? Was it really mass immigration that was the problem? Or was it the fact that the lawyers weren't doing their jobs? The fact that the police weren't doing their jobs? The fact that the empire was overextending itself and therefore had difficulty balancing external obligations with internal obligations? I think that, this is going to be something really interesting if you're studying European history and American history, because I think you're going to find out overall that you really are dealing with systems that become indebted and then torn between external forces and internal forces. And when you think about it in terms of religion or race, it's not really all that comprehensive. It just so happens, however, that because markers like religion and race are so obvious, that they're the ones that historians focus on, because at least it's very obvious. Whereas if you're trying to look at GDP, which can be, the numbers can be manipulated any way, we're trying to look at economic output, especially now with all these different GATT trading agreements, it's extremely complicated. And so it's a lot easier for historians, especially when they're teaching teenagers or children, what happened? Well, it happened because of hate. Well, maybe, but what happened 10 years before all of those extremists came into power? What happened when things were, why was all of this normalized? What was, ultimately a breakdown has to happen somewhere else within civil society. Because again, immigrants for the most part will not go to a place that is declining economically. They will only go to a place that is able to absorb them economically. And that almost always means a country that is a leader in something and a country that is doing well economically, which is why Germany at the time was one of the most diverse countries in the world. And that's why they were able to massacre so many different kinds of people. When the extremists were able to take over, establish continued economic upswings. Again, Volkswagen, Adidas, all those companies were made during the reign of the National Socialists. So you sort of have a very interesting situation happening now, but I think that if you really want to study what's going on, it's really all about the pulls and pushes between the external and the internal, and ultimately you want to look at what happened 10 years before any sort of problem became obvious, or even 20 years before, and you want to see what were the breakdowns, what was happening, what was really happening at the civil society level with the lawyers, with the teachers, with the government employees that allowed the private sector or one branch of the government, like the military, to essentially take over or, influence civil society more than the other branches of government that you would think would have some input.